Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to topic 2 for this week in American History 2. And to wrap things up this week, we're going to talk very briefly about the prelude to World War II and what exactly many of the major countries involved were up to between World War I and leading up to World War II. So, as always, we'll start with the key terms. We're going to talk about a few important figures and important countries today. Specifically, we're going to look at Benito Mussolini. We're, of course, going to look at Adolf Hitler. We'll look at Japanese imperialism, we'll look at Joseph Stalin, and we'll conclude talking about the infamous policy of appeasement. Now, I'm going to go over again, of course, the upcoming assignments we have to do this week, or do the next few weeks. My apologies, you definitely don't have all this due in 1 week. Now, of course, if you have any questions about any of this, please let me know, but I'm not going to spend much time going through it since I already did that for our last video. But again, if you have any questions, please let me know. In the meantime, as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, what is considered to be perhaps the biggest cause of World War I or World War II, especially at least from the European perspective, is the infamous Treaty of Versailles. In case you forgot, the Treaty of Versailles is the treaty that ended World War I. Historians have identified a few specific areas that they believed helped cause World War II. Specifically, the War Guilt Clause first. In this clause, it literally stated that Germany was forced to accept responsibility for starting the war and was therefore in debt to the rest of the Allied powers. Because this was used to also justify the reparations that Germany was required to pay. Germany was given a debt of 132 billion golden Reichsmarks to the Allied powers. This would be, for example, the equivalent of 33 billion US dollars. Finally, Germany lost quite a significant amount of territory as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. They lost approximately 10% of their former territory. First, they lost literally all of their overseas colonies as a result of the treaty. Now, why do you think the Allied powers would want to do that? Think like an imperial power for a second. As I sit here awkwardly and wait. But yes, very good. On the one hand, it could just be seen as a greedy power move, because as you might guess, these colonies were not set free. Many of them were taken over by various members of the Allied powers. Also, as I mentioned a couple weeks ago, this is a big part of the Allied powers' attempt to prevent Germany from becoming powerful again. If you take away all of their colonies, you take away a big source of their revenue, because they're no longer able to exploit these colonies for resources. They also lost some of their European territory to places like France, Belgium, and Denmark. Also, the infamous German corridor was lost specifically. This is a portion of East Germany that was given to create the new nation of Poland. This corridor contained about 6 million ethnic and cultural Germans, so people who were descended from various Germanic tribes and just practiced German cultural traits. Now, how do you think that is specifically going to influence World War II? Awkward pause again. But yes, for those of you who know anything about how World War II started, this is the area that Germany invaded first. This lost territory and these lost Germans would be used to justify many of the first invasions and military actions of World War II. Germany claimed that they were just reclaiming their lost territory and saving their lost citizens. Now, it is important, of course, since this is an American history class, to focus on what America was up to between the wars. Once again, America was mainly isolationist between World War I and World War II. If you remember from a couple of weeks ago, the Senate actually refused to join the League of Nations after World War I was over. Does anyone remember what the League of Nations was and why it matters that America didn't join? Yes, very good. Imaginary class. The League of Nations was, of course, basically the forefather of the UN. It was a group that was intended to promote world peace and international cooperation among all the different nations in the world. Since America didn't join, it essentially demonstrated that the League of Nations had no real way to enforce its will and couldn't force nations to participate or cooperate. And it, of course, meant that what was already one of the most powerful industrial nations in the world wasn't going to join and aid the League of Nations. So essentially demonstrated that the League of Nations didn't have that much power. Also, during the 1930s, Congress passed a series of neutrality acts, which in a nutshell limited the trade America was going to do and loans they were going to give to quote-unquote belligerent powers. Now, why do you think they would specifically do that based on America's behavior in World War I? Was I, again, stroke my beard like a James Bond villain? But yes, if you remember from last time, one of the main reasons America got pulled into World War I is because they were involved in trade with all the various powers involved in the conflict. This is essentially meant to ensure that America wouldn't get involved into supplying European powers that were at war, which would make them less of a target if war were to break out. However, it is important to note that FDR very quickly began to favor the Allies over Hitler. For example, he was known to be a very close friend of Winston Churchill, which, if you know anything about world history, he was, of course, the Prime Minister of England during much of World War II. In fact, FDR and Churchill quickly agreed on something called the Lend-Lease Act. This was essentially supposed to be a law which would help get around and expose a loophole in the Neutrality Acts. They was able to get around the official Neutrality Act because it wasn't considered a trade. It was considered a loan where any country whose defense the president deemed vital to the defense of the United States could receive loans from the government. It wasn't essentially considered a trade. Now, you could say it still violates the loan idea, but it wasn't considered to be loaning money. They were just letting essentially the Great Britain borrow their ships. I'll get to where I'm good at talking eventually. It's been a long week, as I'm sure you guys can relate. But yes, this shows that FDR and some Americans were very quick to want to get on the side of the Allies, but initially FDR was only able to indirectly support them because so much of America still wanted to be isolationist and stay neutral. Now, to get into some of the major powers of World War II, Il Duce, also known as Benito Mussolini, is essentially the one who got the fascist ball rolling throughout Europe. Benito Mussolini created the first fascist party in Europe in 1919. Now, can anyone tell me exactly what fascism is? Alright, it's a very good imaginary class. In a nutshell, fascism is just essentially considered to be a very far-right political ideology based on dictatorial control, hyper-nationalism, and hyper-expansion. So essentially, Benito Mussolini was able to gain complete dictatorial control over Italy and had it focus on nationalism and expanding their empire across the world. The party, as you might guess, was organized around protesting the Treaty of Versailles. He used a militia called the Black Shirts, which is a very common tactic of fascist groups, as you might know from if you're familiar with Nazi history, which was used to directly suppress political opponents. This, for example, is why political suppression and things like that are such a hotly debated topic still today. One of the first signs of a group starting to lean towards dictator and totalitarian rule is when they use violence to suppress political opponents. That's why, for example, you see things like white nationalism and Black Lives Matter and all those different organizations being so hotly debated. Both sides will essentially try to argue that the other is trying to suppress political opponents like these groups did here. Of course, I'm not going to poke that bee's nest right now, but I just wanted to give you some context on why that's such a hotly debated issue. Because of these tactics, he was eventually declared the Prime Minister of Italy in 1922, was declared the dictator, or Il Duce, by 1925. Now, how might the practices, and perhaps most importantly, the success of Mussolini affect the rest of Europe? As I swivel around in my chair waiting for an answer that's not going to come for a few more days, probably. But yes, it's most importantly, it's the success might inspire other organizations or political groups who have the same ideas to advance their goals and to essentially just go for it, whereas they might have never attempted to try to seize power before. For example, Hitler, for the rest of his life, and even as Mussolini was later disgraced, always deeply valued Mussolini and looked up to him in certain ways, because Mussolini is the one who inspired him to carry out his own fascist plans. Also, by 1935, Italy had successfully invaded and colonized Ethiopia, which of course would inspire the rest of Europe and of course many future fascist organizations to carry out their imperial plans as well. For example, as I just said, Mussolini was credited as being a great inspiration to Adolf Hitler when he took power in Germany. In 1921, Hitler, at just the age of 30, became the head of a Bavarian political party called the National Socialist Workers' Party. For those of you who don't know, Bavaria was one of the most prosperous and populous states in Germany. It's essentially like a North Carolina, a New York, or what have you in America. This group was also formed in protest of the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler set himself apart a bit by specifically blaming Jews and communists for the defeat and surrender in World War I. This was a big tactic that initially did help him get quite a bit of support. Why do you think that would be the case? As I wait for a response. But yeah, this is essentially a way to shift the blame and to get a scapegoat, as many of you might imagine. This is essentially a direct response to the war guilt clause. Many Germans particularly struggle with the idea that they had to be completely blamed for their defeat and were being judged as the entire cause of World War I. This tactic essentially helped to shift the blame to where the majority of the German people could now blame the Jews and the communists for their failures and didn't have to take responsibility for what had happened to Germany. Hitler also, of course, modeled Mussolini's gang tactics. He used various militias. Initially, he would use the SA, or known as the Brown Shirts, and eventually the SS, to attack and provoke political opponents in street fights. Also, he did lead the unsuccessful beer hall push. This is where he attempted to overthrow the government in Bavaria in 1923 directly. Because of this, however, he was imprisoned and was actually given the opportunity to write with his secretary Rudolf Hess the infamous book Mein Kampf. Now, we'll talk a little bit in just a second about why that was such a pivotal moment. But to jump ahead just a bit, by 1932, the Nazi Party was able to gain a political majority due to the worldwide Great Depression. Now, why do you think this Great Depression is what gave Hitler the opportunity to seize power? Yeah, look at today's political climate, for example. It is often during times of great crisis, particularly economic crisis, when more extreme political organizations are able to get more attention and are able to gain power. For example, during all the political and social unrest we have in our country today, many white nationalist groups are getting a lot of attention, and various more liberal groups, are getting a lot of attention as well. When things are calm, people are typically okay with just the more moderate organizations, but when there's a crisis going on, very extreme organizations get a lot of attention. Because of this, the Nazi Party was able to seize the opportunity and get a lot more votes because they were able to blame someone for all the crises and problems that were going on in Germany at the time. By 1934, the Versailles president Paul von Hindenburg had died, and Hitler had completely taken control of the German government. Now, I do recommend that you take another American history class in the future to get this in more in depth, but in the interest of time, that's really all I have time to give you. However, I do want to focus on the beer hall push for just a second. So I have here, of course, attached a YouTube video that I probably can't play for you for copyright reasons, and to discuss a little bit of what the impact of the beer hall push. So, ask yourself these questions as you're going through it. 1. Why is it significant that Hitler was only detained for 5 months after his role in this push? How do you think the failure of the push altered Hitler's attitudes and philosophy? Essentially, why do you think before this he was willing to try to use violent and direct means to claim control, and afterwards he tried to use political, quote-unquote, official means? And finally, why is it important to remember, because of this, that Hitler was, at least somewhat, elected legitimately by the German people? So keep those in mind as you learn a little bit more about what the beer hall push actually was like. In the meantime, we will of course look at the rise of Japan. To look at the rise of Japan, you have to go back to 1853, when Americans first officially made contact with the Japanese. Commodore Matthew C. Perry infamously sailed into the Japanese harbors and forcibly opened up Japan to trade with America. Now, how do you think Japan is going to react to this? For example, how do you think we would react as a country if someone tried to come in and force us to trade or interact with them? Yeah, it's very good. Think about that American pride for a second. Most of us would not like the idea of having someone try to come in and force us to trade or interact with them against our will. Also, for example, for those of you who are a bit familiar with Asian history, you might know that Japan was particularly concerned over what had happened to China when they were forcibly opened up to European trade. Some of you may be familiar with things like the Opium Wars and other big negative impacts this had upon Chinese society. Because of this, many Japanese did not want to be forcibly opened up to interact with the Western world, which led to the 1868 Meiji Restoration, which is basically a nationwide government attempt to modernize Japan so they would not be exploited like China. For example, Japan ended the feudal system, where power was given to the emperor and his advisors. This was essentially an attempt to ensure that the central government would be strong and could control and unite all of Japan, instead of having various local lords hold all the power and keep Japan divided. They also deliberately copied Western dress, military strategies, industry, and various other government practices. So essentially they want to modernize and copy the industrial model of Europe so they can protect themselves from direct European and American influence. As a result of this, like much of the Western world, Japan started practicing imperialism. Their main target in expansion was China. Why do you think China would be their main target? I hope these awkward pauses are as fun for you as they are for me. But yeah, think about when we think of Asia, who are the typical powerful countries you think of? The first two are probably going to be Japan and China. At this time, China was still considered to be one of the dominant, if not the dominant powers in Asia. Japan essentially wanted to supplant them and be the dominant power in Asia to protect themselves from Western imperialism and to spread their own ideology. This led to a series of conflicts where Japan attempted to expand their power. For example, from 1894 to 1895, we had the First Sino-Japanese War, where Korea was taken over and became a Japanese vassal state, along with portions of Taiwan and other Chinese territories. In 1904 and 1905, Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. Now, how do you think the Western powers would particularly react to this conflict? Yeah, this is essentially, as you might guess, considered to be Japan's coming out party into the global world powers. After this, European countries and America were forced to take Japan a little bit more seriously, since they had defeated a more widely recognized European power. So again, essentially this is where Japan was able to demonstrate that their modernizing efforts were having a direct impact. By 1931, Japan had invaded Manchuria, and by 1937, China and Japan were officially at war. This is important because it's considered to be the start of the Pacific theater of World War II. I'll talk about this a little bit more next week, but many historians argue because of this, World War II should actually be considered to start in 1937 and not 1939. Because a lot of times we start with the start of the European War, but the war that was going on in Asia had already been going on for some time. Also, we'll of course look at the dictator in Russia. Joseph Stalin became the head of the Soviet Union in Russia after Lenin died in 1924. If you remember from last time, this was the first communist country, or the communist dictatorship that was ever established in Europe. Why is that historically significant again? We talked about that a little bit a couple of weeks ago. Yes, very good. This is essentially the start of our Cold War conflicts and the capitalist versus communist ideology battles. For example, we talked a bit last week about how Americans were already scared of communist infiltration in the country. Joseph Stalin, of course, is going to only make those fears worse, as we'll talk a little bit about over the next couple of weeks. Stalin was directly responsible for expanding communist control of the economy in Russia, which again made these fears even worse. For example, he collectivized all the farms and industries. Does anybody know what that means? Those of you who are big capitalist fans probably know what this means at the very least. But yes, very good. Any economic fans in here? This is where essentially the government takes over the ownership of all farms and industries, which is considered to be one of the major goals of communism. The government controls all production and controls all industries. This, of course, made capitalist fears in America and other parts of Europe even worse, because this was a sense where the private economy and the free market economy was being completely done away with. Stalin was also known for being extremely cruel in protecting his power and spreading communist ideology. For example, as you can see up here, he would deport, starve, jail, and or kill anyone who resisted the collectivizing push. He also went after many of his own citizens and even top advisors. For example, in just 1937, it's estimated that about 1 million people in Russia were executed or starved to death, and twice as many as that died in prison. Between 1936 to 1938, there was a great purge in the Soviet Union, where about 600,000 to 1.2 million Communist Party and military leaders were executed. In 1941, Stalin participated in the infamous Red Army Purge, where many of his top military advisors and soldiers were also killed once again. Now, why are these two in particular so significant? How do they maybe contrast with what Hitler is famous for example? Alright, yes, very good. It's considered to be a big contrast between Hitler blaming his enemies and specifically focusing on his enemies when carrying out various persecutions. Stalin demonstrated with these actions that he would not only go after clear enemies, even his own military advisors and soldiers weren't safe from his paranoia. This is one of the main reasons why Stalin is particularly considered to be so cruel, particularly in protecting his own power due to his paranoia. Now, as we go over the next couple of weeks, also keep in mind this question here. Why do you think we often consider Stalin to be not as evil necessarily as we do Hitler? We always typically, when we look at World War II, we also always focus on the horrible things Hitler did, which of course we should, because he did do many horrible things. But why do you think we often don't lump Stalin into the same boat? Think about that as we continue. In the meantime, we'll wrap things up looking at the policy of appeasement. The policy of appeasement was essentially a unified effort by the Allied powers to let Hitler achieve many of his goals he wanted to accomplish in an effort to try to keep him violent, or try to keep him from getting violent. Now, why do you think Europe would go along with this strategy, and why do you think it didn't work? Awkward pauses again. Right. To understand why Europe went along with this strategy, you have to think of the time period. When Hitler's first gained power, this was still less than 20 years after World War I had ended. Most of Europe was not willing to get into another global conflict like that again. So therefore, many European leaders were desperate to just appease Hitler to keep him from getting violent and prevent another war. As you can see with this political cartoon here, this is essentially considered to not have worked because it just emboldened Hitler. Instead of appeasing him and causing him to calm down, he would just eventually go for more and more because he didn't think the European powers would actually stand up to him. As a result, Hitler was able to accomplish many things without ever having to go to war. For example, in March of 1935, Hitler was able to publicly reject the Versailles Treaty, which prevented Germany from rearming. No European power stood against this. By 1936, German troops had reoccupied the Rhineland. This was a former German territory that had previously been occupied by French and Belgian troops. This again shows he's ignoring provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. By 1938, Germany had occupied Austria, and Austria was mostly willingly annexed. Finally, by October of 1938, Germany had occupied the German corridor in Czechoslovakia. So a portion of German territory that had been given to Czechoslovakia was now once again reclaimed by Germany. Now, to wrap things up, let's look at these political cartoons right here that both deal with issues of imperialism. This is a World War II era, of course, Dr. Seuss cartoon showing an appeaser being surrounded by various Nazi-looking monsters. On the right, we have a politician attempting to appease a giant wolf that would represent, of course, our war on terror. Now, To wrap things up, I want to ask you guys this question. This is something else we'll discuss a bit throughout the semester. Was it actually a terrible idea for the Allied powers to try to appease Hitler? And is it ever a good idea to try to appease a potential enemy? Why or why not? So keep that in mind, of course, as always. We will discuss that in the future. In the meantime, once again, here's your upcoming assignments. If you have any questions about them, please let me know. In the meantime, have a great rest of your week, and do enjoy your weekend. Adios.